Salutations, the name's Cavill. In D&D, you have two hands and gotta kill a dragon with them. Instincts tell us to grab the biggest thing we can find and swing, but maybe you wanna be different. What if the left and the right can't get along? What happens when you've got two strong independent hands that each want their own weapons? Hasbro calls the fucking cops apparently, because dual-wielding, or multi-attack as the game calls it, may be D&D's most broken mechanic. Let's start from the beginning. How does dual wielding work exactly? Every weapon in 5e has properties, and you're looking for weapons with one-handed, lightweight, and finesse. One-handed and lightweight are self-explanatory, but finesse requires a bit of explanation. There's a stat in the game called dexterity, which determines your ability to move, dodge, sneak, and for finesse weapons, attack. If you want to use a big strong axe, you'll have to spend skill points on your strength stat, but finesse weapons let you dump your strength stat, which allows you to train more important stats like health or charisma. The only playstyle competing with it is the sword and board, which is a pretty close call. Now the only weapon with all three properties is a short sword, so you grab two and run to the goblin. Now how do you actually perform a multi-attack? Well, in D&D, each turn you have three types of actions. Actions, bonus actions, and object interactions. Pulling out your weapon at the start of combat is considered an object interaction, meaning to pull out two different weapons requires your full action, meaning that you essentially just miss your turn. Most DMs will probably be willing to hand wave that rule, but not all of them, so make sure you talk about it beforehand. Back to the goblin scenario, you use your main action to attack with your short sword and deal 1d6 plus your dexterity bonus. Then you use your bonus action to multi-attack with your second short sword, which does 1d6 with no bonus. Assuming your damage bonus is +3, this means your two short swords will do an average of 9 damage per turn, which perfectly equals the average damage of a two-handed greatsword. The difference, a greatsword only needs to land one successful attack, while short swords need to land two of them. So what can we do to pump up that damage and make the two attack rolls worth it? The first option is the two-handed fighting style, which adds your dex bonus to your multi-attack. The second option is dual wielder, which is one of the most interesting feats in the entire game. Firstly, it grants +1 AC, which is the highest floating modifier offered by any feat. Secondly, it lets you draw two weapons using only one object interaction, eliminating the problem I mentioned earlier. Thirdly, and most importantly, your weapons no longer need the lightweight property in order to perform a multi-attack, which means you can finally swap your short swords for rapiers. These will turn your average 9 damage into an average 14 damage, which is hefty, but the costs are hard to deny. The two-handed fighting style is only available to fighters and rangers, meaning that to put it on a barbarian, paladin, rogue, etc., you'd need to dedicate a second feat, which is ridiculous. You might be asking, well, can't you just take one level of fighter? And the answer is, not really, and I'll get into why later. Even then, however, fighting styles are incredibly useful, from interception to mariner to blind fighting to druidic warrior. Giving up one of those for a boosted multi-attack is difficult to justify, even in the ideal situation where you're playing fighter/ranger. The dual-wielder feat, however, takes this exact problem and squares it, because not only can feats be so much more incredibly powerful, but each one comes with extreme costs that an extra 2 damage per turn can't come close to justifying. Full stop, do not take this feat. I'll spend the rest of this video talking about short swords rather than rapiers, so consider multi-attack to do an average of 12 damage. If you want a feat that'll enable a bonus action attack, Polearm Master is a bit of an elephant in the room. With it, you not only have an average of 13 damage, a 10-foot attack range, free attacks against any melee opponent, but you don't even need a fighting style. Polearm Master is such an amazing feat that using multi-attack is the equivalent of using Internet Explorer. So let's talk about the martial classes that don't have access to Polearm Master: rogues and monks. Starting with rogues, because swinging around multiple small weapons seems like it would come naturally. That assumption would be incorrect, however, because rogues get no fighting styles and the sneak attack bonus is once per turn. The much bigger issue, however, is consuming your bonus action every turn, because Rogue's cunning action is one of the game's strongest abilities. As a rogue, if you go an entire turn without dashing, disengaging, or hiding, you're doing something wrong, and multi-attack forces that playstyle. It becomes downright embarrassing if you try to multi-attack as a monk, however, because all of the on-paper benefits are baked into the base class at level 1. Monks can already attack full force using their dex, and they can do a bonus action unarmed strike. This is why you can't just take one level of fighter to obtain the two-handed fighting style. Taking one level of monk does better in every conceivable way. But hell, if you want a strong bonus action attack, you don't even need multi-classing or a feat. There are several races that have it packed in at level 1. I haven't even gotten to the kicker yet. At level 5, each martial class unlocks the ability Extra Attack, which doubles their damage output. Unless you're dual-wielding, of course, because you can't activate multi-attack more than once, meaning your damage output is multiplied by 1.5. If Polar Master was the kiss of death to multi-attack, then extra attack is the coffin nail. Shout out to the fighter class who eventually has 4 attacks per turn, multi-attack becoming more and more useless with every single one. So I've done a lot of complaining, but that's not what a good D&D player does. No, D&D is about looking at your situation and finding all of the angles your DM didn't plan for, and that's what I did. Have a short list of multi-attack options I came up with that managed to be viable. Ranger is the only class that was designed with multi-attack in mind. It uses dex over strength, gets the two-handed fighting style, and only 1 extra attack. It also gets a massive boon in the form of an exclusive spell, Hunter's Mark. I mean, a Hexblade Warlock could probably do the same thing, but you'd have to be more creative than me. This is a unique scenario where each attack gets its own boost, so the more attacks, the better. A similar effect could be found in the Grung race. Every time they attack, the opponent makes a con save or takes 2d4 poison damage. And if you really just hate your DM, consider a Grung Ranger that multi-attacks for an average of 40 damage per turn. I think this scenario demonstrates the problem Hasbro is trying to avoid by kneecapping multi-attack. When you give players the option to multiply their attack output, the line between optimal play and power gaming becomes harder to discern. It's why they're so hesitant to make the monk good. Now we all hate playing D&D at level 1, but this is when multi-attack is at its strongest. Your character has very few abilities competing for your bonus action, and extra attack isn't even on the horizon. In other words, if you're playing a beginner campaign that ends level 3, this is your dual wielder's time to shine. But to speak more broadly, don't fret even in Curse of Strahd. If you're in one of the rare D&D campaigns that actually reaches level 8, you're fully able to grab a new two-handed weapon and change your fighting style. The best thing about multi-attack is how easily you can ditch it once it becomes a hindrance, unless you take that damn feat. In D&D, there are 2 sizes of playable races, medium and small. Being small comes with a host of disadvantages, the biggest being the inability to use two-handed weapons. This makes them a natural fit for rogues and monks, but do you want to play a tiny fighter for some reason? Well, the best race for it is probably Halfling, cause multi-attack will cause you to roll twice as many 1s as a typical player. That's kinda where it ends, because multi-attack here is really less of a strategy and more of a coping mechanism. One reason people call multi-attack viable is that you have 2 chances to land a critical hit, which is fallacious on the face of it because you also have 2 chances to roll a 1. But let's play ball, a crit will double your damage output if you land a 20, unless you're using multi-attack, in which case it multiplies your damage output by 1.5. Seem familiar? You will technically roll twice as many 20s, but those crits are incredibly meager compared to those of a two-handed weapon. This problem stacks with extra attack to create an incredibly ugly half-orc, but a surprisingly handsome fighter. Now I know everybody memes on the champion subclass as the D&D beginner trap, but it surprisingly has a lot of synergy with multi-attack. Firstly, 10% crit rate, eventually becoming 15. I like those odds and makes multi-attack seem a bit more worth it, as you're likely to land a crit every other turn. The next benefit is gaining a secondary fighting style, which helps you justify taking 2-weapon fighting. Thirdly, the champion subclass adds nothing but passive mechanics, which is a blessing in disguise because multi-attack consumes all of your bonus actions. Now with all the caveats, why am I marketing crit fishing as a viable strategy? Well, this is where it gets complicated, so watch the screen closely. Each weapon has a damage type. The maul deals bludgeoning, the lance deals piercing, the great axe deals slashing, and these are the only options for two-handed fighters. They're interchangeable, except that the maul deals less damage on a crit, while the lance is just all around terrible. This means that crit fishers are forced to use the great axe, which isn't a problem until you realize that each damage type also has a feat dedicated to it, and the slasher feat is just awful. To make it simple, two-handed crit fishers must take a good weapon with a bad feat, or a bad weapon with a good feat. This is when multi-attack truly begins to shine, as short swords deal piercing damage and the piercer feat is just incredible. Man, I'm realizing that multi-attack rewards you for being completely lobotomized. It encourages you to choose champion fighter, run directly to the opponent, do nothing but attack, pray for crits, and never play past level 3. At that point, play a barbarian. Now, with rules as written, you cannot multi-attack using a ranged weapon, but you can using a weapon that has the thrown property. If you don't know the difference, a ranged weapon requires ammo, while a thrown weapon is ammo. This specific playstyle uses strength over dex, so take the hand axes. You might be asking why you aren't using finesse, and that's because the rules are swapped this time around. Ranged attacks use dex by default, and strength-based options are exceedingly rare, so if you have the option to use a short bow with that sweet, succulent 80-foot range, don't waste it. This build is for a barbarian or paladin when the dragon just won't land. Definitely not ideal, you likely won't even have the two-weapon fighting style, but oftentimes it's your only option. It does have one advantage over multi-attack, however, which is that bonus actions are typically reserved for either movement or magic. Every step counts when you're engaged in melee combat, not so much ranged combat. Waste bonus actions to your heart's content. The only hurdle to fully utilizing it is that you have 3 attacks, but you don't have 3 hands or 3 object interactions. This means you need to bribe your DM until he ignores the entire concept of drawing weapons, otherwise you're better off ditching multi-attack and using javelins for the plus 10 range. If you're playing with one of the few DMs who allow firearms and want him to never allow firearms again, consider dual-wielding them.
I thought you can't multi-attack with ranged weapons.
Well, there are 2 exceptions. Hand crossbows, which aren't worth it, and pistols, which are very worth it. 2 caveats. 1, you need the gunner feat. 2, pistols are not lightweight, so you need to take the dual-wielder feat as well. 3, the 30-foot range is much better than a polearm, but it still puts you in harm's way. If you're a human fighter, then consider taking sharpshooter as well. Put it all together at level 5 and you're doing an average of 24 damage per turn. It's less crazy than the Grung Ranger, but you'll still give Tiamat a run for her money. This one will sound hypocritical, but hear me out. While a rogue and a monk typically have no use for multi-attack, they also typically have no use for shields or two-handed weapons. This makes it more of a why not situation. Even if you aren't using multi-attack, it's nothing but a good option to keep around. Maybe once in a blue moon you'll see the perfect opportunity. With all the mean things I've said about multi-attack, I feel the need to remind everybody that, while ideally no playstyle should be a simple downgrade, playing optimally remains completely optional. I once played as a centaur cleric who lost one of his arms in war, and one time I played as a senile wizard with a passive perception of 3. The beautiful thing about D&D is that it's not about having high numbers, it's about having memorable moments. They can be funny, awesome, or even tragic, and bad stats help with that as much as good stats do. When I played a dual wielder, I was aware at all times that the damage I dealt was less than optimal. Does that mean I regret playing a swashbuckling raptor named Rodney? In a different game, definitely. But I think the self-defeating nature of multi-attack in a twisted way manages to perfectly represent the core of D&D, and that's the only thing it'll ever have on Polearm Master.